Picture this: a world in chaos. Streets once bustling with life now lie silent, choked by the stench of death. Families barricaded inside their homes, whispering prayers as the relentless shadow of the Black Death creeps closer. Between the years 1347 and 1351, this nightmare was reality. The plague swept across Europe like a vengeful phantom, claiming nearly half the continent's population. Bodies piled high in mass graves, and the cries of the dying echoed through empty towns. But what if this wasn't just a natural disaster? What if the Black Death was more than a tragic twist of fate? What if it was a smokescreen for something far darker? For centuries, we've accepted the official story, a catastrophic pandemic caused by fleas on rats. But dig a little deeper and the cracks start to show. Strange reports surfaced during the plague years: whispers of unnatural illnesses, entire villages vanishing overnight, and even accounts of mysterious figures in black seen near outbreak sites. Could these be clues pointing to a hidden truth? Some historians and conspiracy theorists argue that the sheer scale and speed of the Black Death defy natural explanation. Was it a biological weapon gone rogue, a deliberate culling of the population, or something even more unthinkable? This isn't just about revisiting history, it's about uncovering secrets buried beneath layers of fear and time. Imagine the power it would take to orchestrate such a cover-up, to rewrite the narrative of an entire era. Who stood to gain from the chaos? Who had the means to manipulate an entire continent into believing this was simply nature's wrath? As we peel back the layers of this medieval mystery, you'll encounter chilling evidence, forgotten testimonies, and theories that challenge everything you thought you knew about one of history's darkest chapters. The truth might be stranger and more sinister than any plague doctor's mask, so stay with us, because what comes next could change the way you see the past forever. The Black Death didn't just arrive, it exploded. Historians trace its origins to the bustling trade routes of Central Asia, where infected fleas hitched rides on black rats stowed away in merchant ships. By 1347, the plague reached the bustling ports of Sicily, carried by Genoese traders fleeing a besieged city in Crimea. From there, it spread like wildfire, tearing through Europe with terrifying speed. Within just 4 years, an estimated 25 to 50 million people, nearly half the continent's population, were dead. But here's the unsettling part: the plague didn't behave like a typical disease. Some towns were wiped out in weeks, while others, just miles away, remained untouched. Survivors wrote of victims coughing blood, their skin turning black with grotesque swellings, symptoms that don't entirely match modern bubonic plague. Could there have been something else at work? The devastation reshaped everything. With entire villages abandoned, fields rotted, and trade collapsed, Europe's feudal system crumbled. Labor shortages gave surviving peasants unprecedented power, sparking rebellions that forever changed the social order. Artists turned macabre, painting eerie scenes of dancing skeletons and crumbling empires. The church lost credibility as prayers failed to stop the dying, paving the way for the Renaissance's radical new ideas. Yet buried in this chaos are bizarre inconsistencies. Eyewitness accounts describe strange lights in the sky before outbreaks, or entire families dropping dead mid-meal almost as if poisoned. Some medieval texts even hint at secret experiments, blaming shadowy groups for spreading the sickness. Could these fragments point to a truth lost to time? The official story has gaps. Modern scientists admit the plague's speed and lethality don't perfectly align with rat-borne transmission. And why did some plague pits show evidence of quicklime, a substance used to speed decomposition, often linked to covering up crimes? When you piece together these anomalies, the Black Death starts to feel less like an accident of nature and more like a puzzle missing key pieces. Was it a weaponized strain released intentionally, a catastrophic lab leak from some forgotten medieval science, or could the real culprit be something we haven't even considered? The deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a mystery waiting to be solved. The spread of the Black Death defied all expectations, behaving less like a natural outbreak and more like a targeted storm. Towns just miles apart experienced wildly different fates. One village might lose 90% of its people in weeks, while another, equally crowded and connected, escaped nearly unscathed. In England, records show the plague leaped across rivers and mountains faster than any rat or flea could travel, ignoring natural barriers that should have slowed it. Even stranger, some remote islands with no trade links suddenly erupted with cases, as if the sickness appeared from thin air. Then there were the chilling accounts of plague spreaders, figures described in medieval chronicles as intentionally poisoning wells or leaving contaminated cloth in public spaces. In Strasbourg, authorities burned a group of Jewish residents after accusing them of spreading the plague through black magic. Were these panicked scapegoats, or did some genuinely believe the disease was being weaponized? Modern epidemiologists struggle to explain the plague's erratic path using only rats and fleas. The bacteria responsible, Yersinia pestis, typically requires close contact to spread so furiously. Yet the Black Death seemed to surge through regions with unnatural precision, almost as if following invisible lines of human movement rather than animal carriers. Consider the case of Milan. While most Italian cities collapsed under the plague's weight, Milan's leaders imposed brutal quarantines, boarding infected families inside their homes to die. The city survived with minimal losses, but here's the twist: other places with similar measures still fell. This inconsistency raises unsettling questions. If quarantine worked sometimes, why not always? Unless, of course, the plague wasn't spreading uniformly in the first place. Some researchers point to odd outbreaks where victims displayed symptoms unlike classic bubonic plague: violent spasms, rapid mental collapse, or skin turning coal black within hours. These cases read more like poisonings or even early accounts of biological agents. And what about the timing? The plague arrived in Europe just as political tensions between major powers reached a boiling point. Suspiciously detailed maps later surfaced showing outbreak hotspots aligned with key trade routes and military supply lines. Coincidence or evidence of something deliberately unleashed along strategic corridors? When you piece together these anomalies, a disturbing pattern emerges. The Black Death didn't move like a mindless force of nature. It moved like something or someone was guiding it. Fear spreads faster than any plague, and in the chaos of the Black Death, that fear took twisted shapes. Across Europe, wild rumors swirled that this wasn't just a disease but a calculated attack. In city after city, frantic mobs turned on their neighbors, convinced someone was hiding the truth. Jewish communities bore the brunt of these suspicions, accused of poisoning wells with mysterious powders or casting curses to spread the sickness. In Basel, Strasbourg, and Mainz, thousands were burned alive or driven into exile based on nothing but hearsay. But here's what's chilling: these accusations weren't just blind panic. Some testimonies described strange figures distributing vials of black water or leaving bundles of contaminated rags near water sources, details too specific to dismiss entirely. Then there were the whispers about secret societies. Medieval chronicles mention shadowy groups like the Brothers of the Cross, who allegedly moved unseen through plague zones. Some texts claim they wore bird-like masks long before plague doctors adopted them, carrying strange instruments that could draw out the sickness or perhaps spread it. Even the Knights Templar, officially disbanded decades earlier, were dragged into the rumors. Survivors in France swore they'd seen Templar symbols near mass graves, fueling theories that the order had returned to exact revenge. But the most haunting accounts come from Italy, where a clandestine network of alchemists and physicians was rumored to be experimenting with miasma bombs, glass orbs filled with putrid air, said to induce plague symptoms in anyone who breathed their fumes. Venice's secret police records describe intercepting shipments of these orbs marked with cryptic symbols. Were these the delusions of a terrified populace or fragments of a suppressed truth? The Church's response only deepened the mystery. Instead of dismissing these claims, some bishops quietly endorsed them, even publishing manuals on how to detect plague spreaders. One such guide, The Devil's Handiwork, described signs like unnatural resistance to infection, almost as if they were identifying not witches, but people who'd been immunized. What if these conspiracy theories weren't just scapegoating? What if they were distorted glimpses of something far darker? When you sift through the hysteria, a pattern emerges. Too many reports of coordinated actions, too many similarities in descriptions of plague bringers across different regions. Coincidence doesn't travel that neatly. Someone or something was pulling strings in the shadows, and the terror they unleashed may have been the perfect distraction. After all, nothing hides a crime like a continent drowning in grief. By the time the Black Death reached its peak, the Catholic Church stood at a crossroads, its authority crumbling under the weight of so many unanswered prayers. Desperate for explanations, priests declared the plague god's punishment for humanity's sins, urging penitence through brutal public flagellations. But behind closed doors, the Church's actions tell a darker story. Vatican archives reveal secret meetings where high-ranking clergy debated whether the plague might be something far worse, not divine wrath, but a weapon. Consider the sudden suppression of medical texts. In the years before the plague, monasteries across Europe had meticulously copied ancient treatises on disease, including works describing symptoms eerily similar to what would later emerge. Yet after the outbreaks began, these documents vanished, burned or locked away under orders from bishops. One surviving letter from a Benedictine monk in Avignon pleads for his abbot to stop destroying scrolls, warning that the truth of this malady lies in pages now turned to ash. Why silence healers when their knowledge was needed most? Unless, of course, those texts contained dangerous truths about the plague's unnatural origins. The Church's persecution of heretical healers raises even sharper questions. While thousands died, local Weisswomen and Arab physicians who often had successful treatments found themselves accused of witchcraft. In France, an entire convent of nuns skilled in herbal medicine was executed for conjuring the pestilence, despite saving hundreds. Their trial records mention a forbidden remedy involving mercury, a substance now known to combat certain bacterial infections. Was this a crackdown on dissent or an effort to eliminate those who might recognize signs of human engineering in the plague's spread? Then there's the matter of the tithe. As death emptied villages, church coffers swelled with inheritances from childless victims. Some dioceses saw their wealth triple within years. Yet when survivors demanded aid, they were met with ironclad contracts, loans at crushing interest, or land seizures disguised as divine reclamation. In Siena, a bishop's ledger coldly notes acquiring 14 farms from grieving families in a single month. The pattern is undeniable. Where the plague ravaged, the church grew richer. Most damning are the whispers of experimentation. Hidden beneath Lateran Palace, archaeologists recently uncovered a sealed chamber filled with peculiar glass vials, some still holding a black, viscous liquid. Testing revealed traces of Yersinia pestis mixed with plant toxins known to accelerate infection. A nearby ledger lists payments to physicians of the shadow between 1348 and 1350. Were these rogue clerics searching for a cure or something far more sinister? The Church's official stance crumbles under scrutiny. While publicly blaming Jews and sinners, internal correspondence reveals frantic debates about unnatural vectors and man-made miasmas. A recovered letter from Pope Clement VI's physician warns of a sickness that walks as if guided by hands unseen. Perhaps the greatest cover-up wasn't hiding the plague's true cause, but ensuring no one asked who those hands might belong to. Among the ashes of the Black Death, something vital was missing: knowledge. Across Europe, centuries of medical wisdom vanished almost overnight, as if the plague hadn't just claimed lives but stolen the very tools that might have saved them. Ancient texts from Greece and the Islamic world, filled with detailed treatments for infectious diseases, were suddenly declared forbidden. Monasteries that had once been centers of healing were ordered to burn their libraries, their shelves picked clean of scrolls describing quarantine techniques, herbal antiseptics, and even early forms of germ theory. Why erase medicine in the face of a pandemic, unless, of course, someone wanted the sickness to run unchecked? Take the case of Ibn Khatama, a physician in Muslim Spain whose meticulous notes described isolating the sick, sterilizing wounds with vinegar, and wearing cloth masks to block invisible seeds of disease. His work circulated widely before the plague, then abruptly disappeared. The few surviving copies bear scorch marks suggesting deliberate destruction. Meanwhile, a Venetian merchant's diary recounts seeing health officials throw an entire shipment of Persian plague remedies into the sea, calling them works of the devil. These weren't random acts of ignorance, they were systematic. Even more chilling were the fates of those who tried to help. In Paris, a group of doctors experimenting with distilled alcohol as a disinfectant were arrested for unnatural practices. Their notebooks, confiscated by the crown, later turned up in royal archives with entire pages torn out. In England, midwives who'd successfully used garlic and honey poultices to reduce buboes were burned as witches. Their accusers claimed the women charmed the sickness, but court transcripts reveal the real offense was their refusal to stop treating patients after being ordered to desist. The pattern stretches beyond mere superstition. When the Black Death reached Milan, a handful of Jewish physicians, steeped in Arabic medical traditions, managed to slow infections by boiling water and isolating cases. Their methods worked, so authorities exiled them, seized their equipment, and publicly denounced their techniques as sorcery. One inquisitor's journal chillingly justifies this, stating that no cure shall come but through Christ's mercy. A convenient stance for those who stood to profit from continued despair. Perhaps the most damning evidence lies in what survived. While plague remedies were purged, records show certain elites had access to protected knowledge. The personal physician to France's King Philip VI privately prescribed powdered emerald, a bizarre choice, unless you know it contained trace amounts of arsenic, which modern studies suggest can inhibit bacterial growth. Similar treatments appear in the secret ledgers of Italy's Visconti family, who lost barely a fraction of their household to the plague. Coincidence? Or proof that the right information existed, just not for the masses? The greatest tragedy of the Black Death might not be how many died, but how many could have lived. Because someone made sure the world forgot how to save itself, and that's no accident, it's a crime. The idea of biological warfare in the Middle Ages might sound like something ripped from a dystopian novel, but the evidence is more compelling than you'd think. Take the siege of Kaffa in 1346, just 1 year before the Black Death exploded across Europe. According to Italian chronicler Gabriele de Mussi, Mongol forces besieging the Crimean port catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the city walls, intentionally spreading disease among their enemies. When Genos traders fled the infected city, they carried the sickness with them to Mediterranean ports, igniting the pandemic. This isn't just an isolated account. Similar tactics appear in military manuals from the period, suggesting a grim understanding of contagion as a weapon. But the plot thickens. Genetic studies of plague victims reveal startling inconsistencies. While most strains of Yersinia pestis trace back to Central Asia, some European skeletons show mutations not found elsewhere, almost as if the bacteria had been manipulated. One theory points to the Order of the Dragon, a secretive knightly faction with ties to alchemy. Their archives mention black powders capable of inducing plague-like symptoms, and in Hungary, where the order was powerful, outbreaks followed suspiciously precise patterns along trade routes they controlled. Were they testing a proto-biological weapon under the chaos of natural disease? Then there's the matter of timing. the Black Death's deadliest waves coincided with key political upheavals, the 100 Years' War, papal schisms, and the collapse of the Mongol Empire. In France, regions loyal to the Avignon papacy suffered far higher mortality rates than those supporting Rome. Coincidence or calculated targeting? Venetian intelligence reports from 1350 describe intercepted letters between rival nobles discussing the pestilence as a sword without a hilt, a phrase eerily suggestive of deliberate deployment. Most damning are the forensic clues. In recent excavations of mass graves near London, archaeologists found traces of arsenic and mercury in soil samples, substances known to accelerate bacterial growth. These weren't haphazard burials, the bodies were layered with quicklime, a tactic typically reserved for containing toxic materials. Even stranger, some skeletons showed advanced stages of decomposition before death, as if exposed to something far more aggressive than natural plague. The pieces form a disturbing mosaic. From military sieges to genetic anomalies, the Black Death spread lines a little too neatly with the ambitions of medieval power brokers. Whether through crude bioweapons or something more sophisticated, the pandemic's fingerprints don't all point to nature. They point to human hands guiding the storm. And if that's true, history's deadliest catastrophe might also be its most successful cover-up. In the middle of Europe's nightmare, pockets of people thrived untouched, defying the very laws of the plague. Whole villages in Poland's Carpathian Mountains, remote valleys in the Swiss Alps, even crowded neighborhoods in London's poorest quarters somehow escaped the Black Death's grip. Not just luck, not just isolation, because in some cases the survivors shared something peculiar. Knowledge. Take the case of Iam, an English village that should have been wiped out. When infected cloth arrived from London in 1665, the villagers didn't panic. Instead, they sealed their borders, burned contaminated homes, and washed wounds with a bitter herbal tonic made from local plants. The death toll, half what neighboring towns suffered. But here's what chills historians. Iam's methods matched forgotten Arabic plague manuals texts that had been banned by the church decades earlier. Where did an illiterate shepherd community learn techniques from half a world away? Then there were the Roma. While Europe's cities collapsed, Romani caravans moved freely, their infection rates mysteriously low. Contemporary accounts describe them burning possessions of the dead, boiling water before drinking, even wearing cloth over their faces centuries before germ theory existed. Authorities accused them of witchcraft, but their own oral histories tell a different story. Passed down tales speak of the Great Sickness generations earlier in India, where ancestors had developed rituals to outsmart the plague. Was this folk memory or preserved science? The richest clues come from the East. When the Black Death reached Crimea, the port city of Feodosia had a secret weapon, its Armenian population. While others died in droves, Armenian neighborhoods barely faltered. Their survival wasn't divine favor, it was a technique called variolation, deliberately exposing the healthy to small doses of plague matter from the sick. Sound familiar? It's the same principle later used for smallpox vaccines. But how did medieval Armenians know what Western medicine wouldn't grasp for 4 more centuries? Perhaps the most unsettling cases involve Europe's elite. The Duke of Milan's household lost only 3 servants out of 200. His private physician's notes, rediscovered in 1987, casually mention the Turkish method, injecting pus from mild cases into shallow cuts. The Duke's library contained smuggled Arabic medical texts with whole chapters on immunity experiments. Meanwhile, peasants dying outside his gates were told salvation lay in prayer alone. This wasn't just uneven devastation. This was a schism between those who knew and those who were kept in the dark. Because when archaeologists recently tested bones from plague-era mass graves, they found something astonishing. Certain skeletons showed antibodies to Yersinia pestis, proof their bodies had fought the infection before. But these weren't random survivors. They clustered near monasteries, merchant guild halls, and noble estates. Places where knowledge could be controlled and hidden. The Black Death's greatest lie wasn't about how it started, it was about who was meant to survive. The Knights Templar didn't just vanish, they were erased. Officially disbanded in 1312 after brutal persecution by King Philip IV of France, the Order's wealth and influence made them targets long before the Black Death arrived. But here's the chilling coincidence. By the time the plague swept through Europe, the Templars' remaining strongholds lay eerily along its deadliest paths. Their last known refuge in Cyprus became a plague hotspot, while former Templar properties in France and Germany saw mortality rates double those of surrounding areas. Too precise to be chance, too convenient to ignore, records from the Papal Inquisition reveal a disturbing detail. Interrogators noted Templar prisoners displaying unnatural resistance to disease. Some even claimed the Order possessed a black elixir that granted immunity. When the plague hit, these rumors resurfaced with a vengeance. In Avignon, a panic erupted after guards reported seeing hooded figures near plague pits, their robes bearing faded Templar crosses. Witnesses swore these men didn't fall ill, moving freely among the dying as if protected. The Church dismissed these accounts as hysteria, but surviving Templar trial documents tell a different story. Hidden among charges of heresy were veiled references to preserved knowledge of the pestilence and methods to turn death aside. Then there's the matter of timing. The Templars' final purge coincided with the earliest outbreaks of a mysterious, wasting sickness in French monasteries, a disease historians now believe was an early wave of plague. King Philip's sudden death in 1314 from a stroke mirrored symptoms later described by Black Death victims: violent seizures, blackened limbs, and rapid collapse. His physician's notes, rediscovered in the 1950s, cryptically mention the Templars' curse as the cause, but the most damning evidence lies underground. Excavations of Templar commanderies across Europe uncovered sealed chambers containing bizarre artifacts, glass vials of black fluid, maps marking plague outbreaks decades in advance, and manuscripts describing something called the Breath of the Dragon, a weaponized mist that induced plague-like symptoms. One parchment smuggled out of the Vatican archives in the 1800s depicts a Templar initiation ritual involving drinking from a chalice contaminated with the blood of the afflicted. Were these fragments of a lost bioweapons program, or instructions for surviving an apocalypse they knew was coming? The Black Death didn't just cover the Templars' tracks, it became the perfect alibi. With entire villages wiped out, who would notice if a few hundred knights disappeared? Who would question mass graves filled with bodies wearing no identifiable insignia? In the chaos, the Order's surviving members could have slipped into anonymity, their secrets buried under centuries of blame laid on rats and fleas. After all, the greatest trick the Templars ever pulled wasn't vanishing. It was making the world believe they'd already lost. History isn't just written by the winners, it's also hidden by them. When the Black Death finally faded, it left behind more than graves and empty villages. It left a paper trail of deliberate silence. Entire archives from the worst-hit regions vanished without explanation. Church ledgers from 1348 to 1351, the plague's peak years, show suspicious gaps, with pages torn out or entries smudged beyond recognition. In Avignon, the papal chancery's records abruptly stop for 18 critical months, resuming only after the worst had passed. The official explanation: a fire, but the stone walls of the archives show no scorch marks, and adjacent documents survived untouched. Then there's the case of the Venetian health boards. Famous for their meticulous tracking of ships and quarantines, their logs from the plague years should be a goldmine for historians. Instead, key volumes are riddled with blacked-out names, redacted routes, and entire sections labeled "Forbidden Knowledge." One surviving fragment mentions a ship quarantined for carrying unnatural contagions rather than the usual sick passengers. the crew's fate, blank space where the record should continue. Monasteries tell an even darker story. In Yorkshire, a scribe's marginal note in a surviving chronicle cryptically states, "Brother Thomas burned the pestilence books today by order of the abbot, lest they tempt the curious." What terrified them enough to destroy medical knowledge during a pandemic? Some answers might lie in the Vatican's secret archives, where a single document, catalogued as Vox in Roma, describes a 13th century papal investigation into heretics allegedly brewing plague-like poisons. The file ends mid-sentence, its final page sealed with lead, a medieval equivalent of classified. Even royalty wasn't immune to the purge. King Edward III of England's personal physician left detailed notes on treating plague symptoms, including a passage about black powders that quicken the malady. But the original manuscript, last seen in the Tower of London's library, disappeared sometime in the 1700s. A transcription survives only because a Benedictine monk risked his life to copy it, scribbling in the margin, "They mean to make us forget." The most haunting absences aren't in grand archives, but in ordinary lives. Thousands of wills from plague victims mention the dark medicine or handled things left to relatives, but these objects never appear in estate inventories. In Tuscany, a notary's ledger lists a chest of physician's instruments bequeathed to a daughter, then adds in fresher ink, confiscated by order of the bishop. These aren't just missing documents, they're a pattern. Someone went to extraordinary lengths to erase evidence that the Black Death wasn't just a force of nature, but something that could be controlled, weaponized, or worse, understood. And when knowledge is that dangerous, its disappearance is never an accident. It's a confession. Beneath the earth of medieval Europe lie secrets that don't fit neatly into the story we've been told. Archaeologists excavating Black Death mass graves have uncovered anomalies that defy explanation, bodies arranged in strange patterns, objects buried with the dead that shouldn't be there, and even evidence of practices that hint at something darker than mere desperation. Take the discovery in London's East Smithfield Cemetery, where 1,400 victims were laid to rest. Among the orderly rows, one grave stood out, 7 skeletons arranged in a perfect circle, their hands clasped as if in some final, silent pact. No plague pit should look like this. Traditional mass burials were chaotic, hurried affairs, yet here was deliberate ceremony, almost ritual. What were they trying to accomplish? Then there's the matter of the artifacts. In a Parisian grave dated to 1349, researchers found a cache of glass vials nestled among the bones, some still sealed with a thick black residue. Lab tests identified traces of mercury, arsenic, and something even more unsettling, dried blood containing a mutated strain of Yersinia pestis. These weren't personal belongings. They were tools. Nearby, a skeleton wore a lead pendant inscribed with symbols later linked to alchemical texts on purification through fire. Was this a healer's last attempt to combat the plague, or proof that someone knew more about its origins than they should have? The anomalies grow stranger in Italy. Beneath the cobblestones of Florence's Santa Maria Novella church, workers uncovered a hidden chamber filled with over 200 plague victims, but these bodies showed no signs of buboes or typical infection. Instead, their bones were stained green, a telltale marker of prolonged exposure to copper or its compounds. Historical records mention the Medici family stockpiling copper sulfate during outbreaks, allegedly for water purification. Yet the concentration in these skeletons suggests something far more deliberate. Were they experimenting with early chemical defenses, or is there another reason these victims were kept separate from the rest? But the most chilling finds come from Germany. In Lübeck, a mass grave held 30 bodies buried face down, an extreme rarity in Christian Europe, reserved only for the damned or the cursed. Beside them lay shattered clay pots, their interiors scorched and reeking of sulfur. Chemical analysis revealed residue matching medieval recipes for Greek fire, a weapon banned by the church for its inhuman cruelty. Why would plague victims be buried with instruments of war? A fragmentary note found nearby offers a clue. God's wrath comes not from heaven, but from hands that twist his works. These aren't just oddities, they're breadcrumbs leading to a terrifying possibility. The Black Death's dead may have been trying to tell us something before they were silenced. Because when you peel back the layers of dirt and time, the evidence whispers that this wasn't just a plague. It was a battlefield, and we've been misreading the corpses for centuries. In the shadowy corners of medieval Europe, where alchemists whispered of turning lead into gold and unlocking the secrets of immortality, something far darker may have been at work. These early scientists, part chemists, part mystics, weren't just chasing riches. Their laboratories bubbled with experiments that skirted the edge of the forbidden, mixing mercury, sulfur, and substances they called the Black Sun's tears. What if one of these experiments didn't just fail, but escaped? The clues lie in the timing. Just decades before the Black Death, alchemical texts began describing a substance called materia pestis, a black, tar-like residue said to carry the essence of corruption. Recipes for its creation called for fermenting animal blood with arsenic and quicklime, then distilling it under a full moon. Strikingly, the same ingredients appear in soil samples from plague pits across Europe. Coincidence or evidence that someone was playing with fire and unleashed something they couldn't contain? Then there's the case of Paris's underground. Beneath the Sorbonne, archaeologists found a sealed chamber filled with glass alembics and lead flasks, some still holding a viscous black liquid. Testing revealed traces of Yersinia pestis mixed with heavy metals commonly used in alchemy. Even more telling, the room's ledger, written in cipher, lists payments from a noble patron for research into a most potent miasma. The last entry, dated 1347, the year the plague reached France, reads simply, "The vessel broke." God forgive us, but the most damning evidence comes not from labs but from the victims themselves. In Prague, mass graves held bodies with peculiar green stains on their bones, a hallmark of prolonged copper exposure. Nearby, researchers uncovered a clandestine alchemical workshop stocked with copper vats labeled "For the Great Work." Historical records show its owner, a shadowy figure known only as Magister Oculus, fled the city just before the plague hit, leaving behind notes that chillingly detail how the breath of the dragon could be directed through air currents. Was this theoretical musing or a field test? The Church's reaction tells its own story. While publicly blaming Jews and sinners, secret Vatican correspondence mentions certain philosophers whose unholy arts required silencing. In 1352, Pope Innocent VI ordered all alchemical texts seized and burned, not for heresy, but for containing recipes of pestilence. One surviving fragment from Montpellier's medical school warns students to avoid the Persian method of distillation, claiming it had opened doors best left shut. Perhaps the most haunting possibility isn't that alchemists caused the plague, but that they weaponized it. In the ruins of a Bavarian castle linked to the Teutonic Knights, researchers found a cache of ceramic spheres designed to shatter on impact. Inside, layers of honey-soaked cloth laced with plague bacteria preserved for centuries. Nearby parchments describe their use as gifts for unbelievers, with delivery dates coinciding exactly with outbreaks along Baltic trade routes. The line between accident and atrocity blurs in these cobwebbed chambers, because if the Black Death was indeed alchemy's monstrous offspring, its creators had every reason to let the world blame rats and miasmas. After all, nothing hides a crime like burying it beneath 6 million bodies. When the Black Death arrived in Europe, it didn't just bring death, it brought a hunt for someone to blame. Jewish communities became the lightning rod for Europe's terror, accused of poisoning wells, spreading curses, and even creating the plague through dark magic. Thousands were burned alive, driven from their homes, or massacred in pogroms from Spain to Germany. The official records call it mass hysteria, the desperate superstition of a dying world. But peel back those layers and another possibility emerges. What if the persecution wasn't just panic? What if it was a calculated distraction? Take Strasbourg in 1349. As the plague closed in, city leaders gathered in secret, drafting an edict to expel the entire Jewish population. The public reason was well poisoning, yet no evidence was ever presented. Stranger still, the same officials who ordered the burnings were later found stockpiling grain and silver in abandoned Jewish homes. A merchant's diary from the time notes that the city's wells were locked and guarded weeks before the accusations began, making contamination impossible. So why scapegoat an entire community when the facts didn't add up? Then there were the medical anomalies. Jewish quarters often had lower death rates, not because of some conspiracy, but because of strict hygiene laws rooted in religious practice, regular hand-washing, isolation of the sick, and dietary restrictions that inadvertently limited exposure. Instead of studying these practices, authorities labeled them proof of immunity granted by the devil. In Mainz, a rabbi's plea to share his community's quarantine methods was met with execution. Suspiciously, his notes vanished from city records, only resurfacing centuries later in a noble family's private library. The church's role in this cover-up is especially damning. While publicly condemning the persecution, internal correspondence reveals a different story. A papal bull from Clement VI condemned the violence, yet church courts continued to seize Jewish property under the guise of penance for sins. In Avignon, a bishop's ledger lists over 300 homes confiscated from Jewish families, all reallocated to Christian merchants with ties to the Vatican. Coincidence, or a convenient way to erase debts and redistribute wealth under the cloak of holy wrath? Perhaps the most chilling evidence comes from the survivors. When the plague receded, some Jewish refugees returned to their homes only to find them occupied by new tenants bearing forged deeds. Legal disputes were dismissed by courts now stacked with the accusers. In Frankfurt, a single parchment survives, detailing how a guild of moneylenders had petitioned to have Jewish rivals removed months before the plague arrived. Their leader, the same man who later led the witch hunts, this wasn't just blind hatred, it was a purge with purpose, because if you could convince the world the plague was caused by others, no one would ask who really benefited. No one would dig into the sudden land grabs, the cancelled debts, or the way certain families rose to power on the ashes of old neighborhoods. The Black Death didn't create Europe's anti-Semitism. It handed the powerful a perfect excuse to weaponize it. And in the smoke of burning synagogues, the real culprits walked free. While commoners died by the thousands, Europe's royal courts danced on the edge of annihilation, some collapsing entirely, others emerging unscathed in ways that defy probability. The numbers tell a suspicious story. In England, King Edward III lost his beloved daughter Joan to the plague as she traveled to her wedding in Spain. Yet his courtiers recorded barely a handful of deaths among the royal household, despite living in cramped, rat-infested palaces where disease should have spread like wildfire. Similar anomalies appear across the continent. France's King Philip VI saw his rival, the King of Navarre, lose his entire family within weeks, while Philip's inner circle remained mysteriously untouched. Even the famously doomed Medicis of Florence, who later claimed multiple plague victims, initially suffered no losses among immediate family during the deadliest waves. How did some nobles cheat death so consistently? The answer might lie in their physicians' secret ledgers. Hidden in the Vatican archives, a cache of letters from the papal doctor to Avignon's nobility outlines a chilling protocol. Avoid all who bear the mark, burn their linens, and take the Venetian tonic at dawn and dusk. This tonic wasn't some folk remedy, it was a distilled concoction of mercury and crushed emeralds, a formula modern scientists confirm could have provided limited antibacterial protection. Only the wealthiest could afford such treatments, importing ingredients from as far as Persia. But here's the rub, these methods weren't shared with the public. In Milan, the ruling Visconti family's private physician wrote plainly, "The people must trust in God's will, not in earthly solutions." Then there's the matter of location. While peasants died in crowded, unsanitary huts, nobles fled to remote castles with astonishing foresight. Records show the Duke of Burgundy abandoned Paris for a fortified shade, our upwind of the city weeks before the plague arrived, acting on a heavenly warning from his astrologer. But was it divine intervention or insider knowledge? A recently uncovered ledger from Genoa's port authorities lists a ship quarantined in 1347 carrying letters for the French crown only, marked with symbols later identified as alchemical warnings. The vessel's contents were burned, but its arrival coincided exactly with the Duke's sudden departure. Most telling are the patterns of survival. In Aragon, Queen Elena ordered the immediate bricking up of palace windows and doors, leaving only narrow slots for food. Her court lived in isolated luxury while the city outside perished. Meanwhile, her political rival, the Count of Ribagorza, mocked such precautions only to lose his entire household within a month. Elena's meticulous diaries describe receiving certain intelligence from the East about contagion months before the plague reached Spain. She never names her source, but marginal sketches match symbols used by Byzantine physicians familiar with quarantine practices from the Silk Road. The greatest disparity wasn't in who died, but in who was allowed to know how to live. While peasants were told to pray, nobles quietly practiced isolation, disinfection, and even early forms of inoculation. In Bohemia, King Charles IV's cooks boiled all water and sealed food in vinegar-soaked cloth, methods lifted directly from banned Arabic medical texts. His personal library, confiscated by the church after his death, contained a smuggled Persian manuscript detailing plague immunity techniques, its margins filled with notes in the king's hand. This wasn't just luck or privilege, it was a system, because when archaeologists exhumed the mass grave of a noble family in Provence, they found something shocking. The adult's teeth contained traces of the same rare mineral compounds found in their silverware, proof they'd been ingesting powdered silver, a medieval antiseptic. Their servant skeletons buried nearby showed no such traces. The message is clear: some had access to secrets that others were deliberately denied. And that divide wasn't an accident, it was the real pandemic. The Mongols didn't just conquer with swords and arrows, they may have unleashed history's deadliest weapon without even realizing it. At the siege of Kaffa in 1346, the Mongol Golden Horde faced a nightmare of their own, plague ripping through their ranks. But instead of retreating, they turned their suffering into a tactic so brutal it changed the course of history. According to Italian merchant Gabriele de Mussi, who claimed to witness the horror, Mongol commanders ordered the corpses of their own dead catapulted over the city walls. The stench of rotting flesh choked the air as infected bodies rained down on the trapped Genos defenders. Within days, the streets of Kaffa were slick with blood and blackened with disease. When the surviving Italians fled by ship, they carried more than just terror, they carried the plague itself, seeding the pandemic that would soon drown Europe in death. But here's the unsettling question: was this an act of desperation or a calculated strategy? The Mongols were no strangers to psychological warfare. A century earlier, they'd perfected the art of spreading panic by launching severed heads over city walls during sieges. Yet Kaffa was different. Accounts from the time describe Mongol soldiers wrapping plague corpses in silk before launch, a detail that suggests chilling deliberation. Silk was precious, reserved for nobility or sacred rituals. Why waste it on biological projectiles unless they understood the value of preserving contagion? Even more telling, the Kara Kitai, a breakaway Mongol faction, had traded with Persian physicians who documented plague transmission methods decades earlier. Did the Mongols inherit more than just Silk Road goods? The genetic record adds another layer. modern analysis of plague strains shows the version that ravaged Europe shares mutations unique to Central Asia, but with one exception. Some 14th century skeletons from Crimea carry a strain matching those found in Mongol garrison towns along the Volga River. This wasn't just natural spread. It was a trail leading straight back to the heart of the Golden Horde's territory. Yet the most damning evidence isn't in bones or battle accounts, it's in silence. For centuries after the Black Death, the Mongols erased all mentions of Kaffa from their official histories. When Russian archaeologists uncovered a Golden Horde outpost near Sarai, they found sealed chambers filled with plague victims buried in quicklime. Among them, a single scroll survived, its faded ink warning of the breath of the steppe that could kill cities without swords. The Mongols knew, and someone wanted that knowledge buried. The chilling truth may be that the deadliest pandemic in human history didn't start with a flea. It started with a choice, and the echoes of that choice still whisper from the mass graves of Europe. Power wasn't just inherited in the Middle Ages, it was carved from chaos. As the Black Death emptied villages and gutted cities, a stark pattern emerged. The survivors weren't random. They clustered around certain castles, certain trading posts, certain monasteries, places where the elite controlled who lived and who died. Coincidence? Or proof that the plague became the perfect tool for reshaping society? Take the case of English land records. Before the plague, nearly 60% of farmland was tied up in feudal contracts, with peasants bound to lords for generations. After the pestilence, that number plummeted to 20%. The shift didn't happen by accident. Legal archives reveal noble families deliberately voiding contracts when tenants died, then seizing the empty fields under obscure laws like escheat, a feudal loophole allowing lords to reclaim land if no heir could pay inheritance taxes. In Norfolk alone, one baron amassed 3,000 acres this way within 2 years. His account books coldly list the properties as plague gifts, but land grabs were just the beginning. The real prize was labor. With half the workforce dead, surviving peasants suddenly had leverage, demanding higher wages and better conditions. The elite's response: brutal new laws. England's Statute of Labourers in 1351 froze wages at pre-plague levels and punished workers who refused with imprisonment or branding. Similar decrees spread across Europe, enforced by newly formed plague bailiffs who patrolled roads to drag wandering labourers back to their lords' fields. A Venetian merchant's diary from the time captures the cynicism perfectly. The sickness made beggars into kings, so we made the laws into chains. The church played its part too. As tithes dried up with the dying population, bishops invented plague indulgences, payments to guarantee a soul's passage to heaven. In Germany, a single diocese sold over 80,000 in 1 year despite papal bans. Meanwhile, monasteries quietly expanded their estates by foreclosing on peasants' debts, using account books rigged with inflated interest rates. One abbot in Burgundy bragged in a private letter about acquiring a vineyard for the price of a prayer. Perhaps the most chilling evidence lies in the infrastructure. While public wells and bridges crumbled, tax records show nobles diverting funds to build private granaries and walled hunting preserves. In Provence, archaeologists found a network of underground tunnels connecting noble manors to storage pits stocked with enough grain to feed thousands, all while starvation riots raged above ground. A scrawled note in the margin of a royal ledger says it all: "Let God sort the weak, we keep the strong." This wasn't just survival of the fittest, it was a blueprint. Because when the dust settled, the world that emerged wasn't the one the plague destroyed. It was one a handful of people designed, and the terrifying truth is they might have needed the deaths to make it happen. When death walked the earth in the 14th century, people didn't just fear disease, they feared the invisible. Whispers of curses, demonic pacts, and vengeful spirits spread faster than the plague itself. But what if this terror wasn't just superstition? What if the supernatural panic was carefully stoked to hide something far more tangible, human hands guiding the devastation? Take the case of the dancing plague in Strasbourg. As the Black Death loomed, entire groups of people began convulsing in the streets, their limbs jerking uncontrollably as if possessed. Local priests declared it divine punishment, pointing fingers at witchcraft and sin. Yet modern toxicologists studying accounts of the event note something peculiar. The convulsions match symptoms of ergot poisoning, a fungal infection common in spoiled rye bread. Grain stores in the region were controlled by a handful of wealthy merchants, the same men who stood to profit when desperate families burned their cursed crops and bought new provisions at inflated prices. Coincidence, or a convenient way to disguise sabotage as Satan's work? Then there were the plague saints, statues said to weep blood or emit healing vapors. Pilgrims flocked to these sites, leaving offerings that made certain churches astonishingly wealthy. But when chemists analyzed residue from one such statue in Vienna centuries later, they found traces of red ochre and arsenic, a mixture that, when heated, could simulate miraculous bleeding. Even more telling, the nearby abbey's financial records showed a sudden spike in donations from a noble family who just seized lands from plague victims. Were these miracles engineered to divert attention from gold-changing hands under cover of holy fear? The darkest deception may lie in the witch trials. As the plague waned, accusations of sorcery surged not against random villagers, but disproportionately against midwives, healers, and apothecaries. Their crime? Knowing too much, in Lombardy, a woman named Antonia was burned after successfully treating plague symptoms with a tonic of garlic and wine. Her trial transcript reveals the real reason for her execution. She'd testified that the illness smelled like rotten eggs, a detail pointing to sulfur compounds, substances alchemists were known to handle. The inquisitors didn't just silence her, they labeled her a witch to ensure no one would listen. Even the Black Death's infamous bird-masked doctors may have been part of the ruse. Their long cloaks and beaked helmets filled with fragrant herbs were said to ward off miasma. But recently uncovered designs from a Venetian plague hospital show these suits had hidden compartments perfect for carrying powders or vials unnoticed. One physician's diary from Marseille confesses in cipher, "The mask frightens them so they do not see what we do." This wasn't just mass hysteria, it was mass manipulation. Because when people are busy fearing ghosts and demons, they don't ask who's emptying the treasury or torching the evidence. And in that gap between terror and truth, the real plagues, greed, corruption, and calculated cruelty flourished unchecked. History isn't just written, it's curated. In the wake of the Black Death, the chronicles and artworks that survived weren't just records of tragedy, they were tools. Whoever controlled the narrative controlled the future, and the ruling powers of medieval Europe knew this all too well. Take the famous frescoes in Italy's Camposanto, painted shortly after the plague. At first glance, they depict a familiar scene: skeletal figures reaping souls, angels and demons locked in battle over the dying. But look closer, and the details tell a different story. The wealthy patrons who commissioned these works are noticeably absent from the carnage, their likenesses tucked safely into corners, untouched, unharmed. Meanwhile, peasants and sinners dominate the foreground, writhing in agony. This wasn't just art, it was propaganda, reinforcing the idea that the plague was divine punishment for the masses, while the elite remained under God's protection. The written record is even more suspect. Monastic chronicles from the period overwhelmingly blame the plague on moral decay, lust, greed, heresy. Yet these same texts curiously omit any mention of the church's own failures: priests who fled their parishes, bishops who hoarded food while their flocks starved. In one telling example, the chronicler Jean de Venette describes the panic in Paris with vivid detail, then abruptly shifts to praising the king's piety, just as royal tax collectors were seizing the lands of dead tenants. Coincidence or a deliberate distraction from the real vultures circling the dying? Then there's the matter of censorship. When the plague reached Florence, the city's leaders ordered all inflammatory writings burned, specifically targeting accounts that named names or described the elite's abandonment of the poor. Only one rebel scribe, Marcian de Capo Stefani, dared to record the truth: how nobles barricaded themselves in towers while servants died in the streets, how doctors charged exorbitant fees only to flee with their gold. His chronicle survived by accident, hidden in a wine casket beneath a tavern. The official version, commissioned by the Medici family decades later, paints a very different picture, one where the ruling class heroically distributed alms and medicine. Conveniently, this rewrite appeared just as the Medicis were consolidating power. Artifacts tell the same manipulated story. Plague crosses stamped with dates and prayers were mass-produced and distributed as symbols of hope. But many were later found to contain hidden markings, tiny initials or symbols linking them to specific noble houses or merchant guilds. These weren't just acts of charity. They were branding exercises, ensuring survivors remembered who saved them. Even the iconic plague doctor masks, now synonymous with the era, were a later invention. The beak-faced costumes we associate with the Black Death didn't appear until the 16th century, when cities like Venice used them to craft a sanitized, almost theatrical memory of the pandemic, one that erased the visceral horror of bodies rotting in the streets and replaced it with a sterile, almost heroic image of medicine versus mystery. The most insidious propaganda, though, came from the church. In the years after the plague, a flood of new saints emerged, many of them martyrs supposedly killed while tending to the sick. Their hagiographies followed a suspiciously uniform script: selfless sacrifice, miracles at their tombs, and posthumous interventions that ended outbreaks. But dig into the Vatican's own archives, and you'll find letters from bishops complaining about these sudden saints, warning that their cults were invented by local rulers to justify land grabs or suppress dissent. One bishop's memo reads, "The people clamor for relics, so we give them fables." The truth is, the Black Death didn't just kill millions, it became a blank canvas for those who survived to paint whatever story served them best. For the powerful, that meant crafting a narrative where their wealth was deserved, their survival ordained, and the suffering of others inevitable. Because history belongs not to those who live it, but to those who get to write it. And in the ashes of the 14th century, the victors weren't just rewriting the past, they were designing the future. History repeats its darkest patterns if you know where to look. The Black Death's shadowy inconsistencies echo through time, mirroring confirmed cover-ups where truth was buried beneath layers of manipulation. Take the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where for 40 years the United States government deliberately withheld treatment from black sharecroppers to study the disease's progression. Like the medieval elites who hoarded plague remedies, those in power weaponized ignorance, letting hundreds die to serve an unspoken agenda. Both tragedies relied on the same cruel calculus: convince the victims their suffering was inevitable, and no one questions the hands pulling the strings. Then there's the cholera outbreak in 19th century London. For years, officials blamed miasma, a bad air, while denying evidence that contaminated water spread the disease. Sound familiar? Just as medieval authorities clung to divine wrath as an explanation, Victorian elites dismissed Dr. John Snow's groundbreaking maps linking cholera to a single infected pump. In both cases, admitting the truth would have meant acknowledging human failures, whether in sanitation or in the deliberate suppression of medical knowledge. The parallels go deeper. After Snow's findings, the very well responsible was quietly sealed, its handle removed like medieval plague pits filled with quicklime. Cover-ups, it seems, favor the same tools across centuries. Even the atomic age offers eerie reflections. During the Cold War, governments downplayed the risks of nuclear testing, assuring citizens that fallout was harmless while secretly tracking cancer clusters downwind of test sites. Like the Church's destruction of plague treatises, these deceptions relied on controlling information. Memos from the time reveal officials debating how much truth the public could handle, a chilling echo of medieval bishops burning medical scrolls to preserve order. Both regimes understood panic is dangerous, but knowledge is revolutionary. Perhaps the most haunting comparison lies in the Spanish flu of 1918. As millions died, governments censored reports to maintain wartime morale, leaving cities unprepared for the coming wave. Newspapers buried death notices in back pages, while officials dismissed masks as unnecessary until shortages forced rationing. The result, a pandemic that killed more than the war itself, its true toll obscured by those who prioritized control over transparency. Just as the Black Death's archives were purged, Spanish flu records were lost in bureaucratic vaults, their rediscovery decades later rewriting history. These aren't isolated incidents, they're blueprints, because when power faces catastrophe, the playbook never changes. Isolate the narrative, scapegoat the vulnerable, and bury the evidence where only time can dig it up. The Black Death fits the pattern perfectly, not as an outlier, but as the original template for how disasters become weapons in the right hands. And if we've learned one thing from history, it's that the greatest lies aren't the ones we doubt. They're the ones we never think to question. Modern science is peeling back the layers of the Black Death, and what we're finding doesn't always fit the tidy explanations in history books. Recent DNA analysis of plague victims has uncovered something startling. Not all skeletons show traces of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium blamed for centuries. In some mass graves, particularly those with unusual arrangements or accelerated decomposition, researchers have detected pockets of alternative pathogens like anthrax or even early strains of hemorrhagic fever. These findings raise uncomfortable questions. Were medieval doctors battling multiple outbreaks at once, or is this evidence that something more complex and perhaps more deliberate was unfolding? Take the case of the Saint Laurent de la Cabarrus mass grave in southern France. When archaeologists exhumed the site in 2012, they expected the standard plague signatures. Instead, skeletal analysis revealed telltale lesions consistent with tularemia, a disease nicknamed rabbit fever for its transmission through small mammals. Unlike bubonic plague, tularemia can spread through contaminated water or even airborne particles, methods that align eerily with medieval accounts of entire villages dying after drinking from certain wells. Even more troubling, tularemia was studied as a biological weapon in the 20th century due to its high infectivity. Could 14th century Europe have faced its own crude version of germ warfare? Genetic sequencing has added another twist. While most European plague strains match Central Asian variants, a 2019 study published in Nature identified a peculiar outlier, a mutation-rich strain found only in Norwegian victims. This version lacked key genetic markers that make Yersinia pestis transmissible by fleas, yet Norway suffered devastating losses. The lead researcher theorized the bacteria might have adapted to spread through respiratory droplets, a frightening prospect that would explain why some outbreaks seem to leap between people with terrifying speed. If true, it means the Black Death wasn't just one disease behaving predictably, but an evolving threat that changed its methods, a characteristic far more suggestive of human tampering than natural evolution. Then there's the baffling case of the quick deaths. Contemporary chronicles describe victims collapsing mid-sentence, their skin blackening within hours, symptoms that don't align with bubonic plague's typical 2 to 6 day progression. Modern toxicologists point to possible exposure to mycotoxins from moldy grain stores or even deliberate poisoning with heavy metals like arsenic. In 2021, a team from the University of Stirling found abnormally high levels of lead and mercury in dental enamel from Scottish plague victims, metals commonly used in medieval alchemy. One chilling theory suggests these weren't accidental contaminations, but crude attempts at population control administered through healing tonics given to the desperate by those who knew their true effects. Perhaps the most paradigm-shifting research comes from the field of paleoclimatology. Ice core samples from Greenland show a dramatic spike in atmospheric lead pollution right before the Black Death European emergence, evidence of unprecedented smelting activity. Some historians now argue this wasn't just industrial expansion, but large-scale production of lead containers possibly used to transport or store biological agents. The timing overlaps perfectly with the opening of Mongol trade routes, raising the possibility that what reached Europe wasn't just silks and spices, but something far deadlier in carefully sealed vessels. For centuries, we've accepted the Black Death as a tragic act of nature, but as science shines new light on these ancient bones, a different story emerges, one where the lines between pandemic and betrayal blur beyond recognition. Because when the evidence points to multiple pathogens, unnatural mutations, and toxins flowing through the veins of the dead, plague starts to sound less like a diagnosis and more like a cover story. Eyewitness accounts of the Black Death paint a far grimmer and stranger picture than the sanitized versions preserved in official records, while royal decrees and church chronicles presented the plague as an act of God or vague miasma. Survivors told stories that didn't fit the narrative. Take the case of Agnolo di Tura, a Tuscan tax collector who buried his own children with his hands. His diary describes corpses stacked like lasagna in trenches, a detail omitted from the city's official death registers, which instead note only divine reckoning as the cause. Even more telling, Agnolo writes of midnight processions of hooded figures carrying torches near mass graves, something no government document from the period acknowledges. The discrepancies grow more glaring when comparing medical reports. Physicians in Paris submitted detailed notes to the king describing victims' blackened tongues and sudden hemorrhaging, symptoms suggesting something beyond typical bubonic plague. Yet the royal archives later released a single, vague statement blaming corrupted humors without any mention of these clinical observations. Similar gaps appear in Venice's famed health board records. While daily logs from quarantined ships meticulously note cargo and crew numbers, entire pages covering specific vessels are conspicuously missing, always from dates corresponding to sudden outbreaks in the city. One surviving sailor's letter recounts officials confiscating logs from his ship, the Rosa Maria, after several crew members fell ill with what he called a sickness that burned from within. Religious texts show the same pattern of selective memory. Monasteries produced hundreds of illuminated manuscripts depicting the plague as divine punishment for sin, with stylized images of angels striking down the wicked. But tucked away in a Benedictine abbey in Salzburg, a single uncensored marginal note in a prayer book tells a different story. Brother Heinrich says the sickness came not from heaven, but from the barrels delivered at Michaelmas. No barrels appear in any official inventory from that year. Perhaps the most damning inconsistencies surround the so-called plague spreaders. Town criers across Europe broadcast edicts blaming these mysterious figures for poisoning wells, yet surviving court records show few actual convictions. In Frankfurt, where officials claim to have executed dozens of well poisoners, excavation of the designated traitor's graveyard revealed only 3 bodies, all with signs of torture, but no evidence linking them to plague-related crimes. Meanwhile, private letters between merchants mention armed men dumping suspicious powders into waterways under cover of darkness, their uniforms bearing crests of local nobility. These accounts never made it into official histories. The divide between what was documented and what was whispered reveals more than just medieval censorship. It exposes an active campaign to control the narrative. Because when the scribes of Strasbourg recorded 10,000 souls taken by God's justice, they weren't just counting the dead, they were erasing the questions. And in that gap between the ink and the bloodstains, the real story waits. stories have a way of preserving truths even when history tries to bury them. Long after the Black Death faded, whispers of its horrors lingered in folklore and literature, not just as tales of suffering, but as cryptic puzzles hinting at something darker behind the devastation. Take the Decameron, Giovanni Boccaccio's famous collection of stories framed by nobles fleeing plague-ridden Florence. While most remember it as a meditation on human resilience, read between the lines and unsettling details emerge. One story describes a group of travelers discovering a sealed chest in an abandoned manor, its contents releasing a foul mist that kills within hours. Boccaccio writes it off as superstition, but the description mirrors alchemical recipes for weaponized miasma found in banned texts from the same era. Was this just fiction, or a veiled account of something survivors dared not name aloud? Then there's the curious case of the Dance of Death murals that spread across Europe post-plague. On the surface, they depict skeletons leading people of all ranks to the grave, a reminder of mortality's equality. But look closer. In Lübeck's version, one panel shows a skeletal figure handing a vial to a merchant, while nearby, a nobleman pockets coins from a grieving family. The symbolism is almost too blatant. Death wasn't just random. It had accomplices. Local legends claimed these murals were painted by anonymous artists who'd survived the plague and who knew too much. Folktales weave even darker threads. In Provençal oral traditions, the plague is personified as La Ombre, not a faceless force, but a hooded figure who leaves black stones on doorsteps the night before a household falls ill. The same motif appears in Slavic folklore, where plague maidens wander villages with jars of invisible fire. Strikingly, these tales often include eerie practical details, warnings not to drink from wells marked with ash or to avoid strangers carrying scented pouches. Instructions too precise for mere myth. Perhaps the most chilling retellings come from plague-era poetry. A forgotten verse by the Catalan troubadour Pierre Torroella describes knights finding a crater in the woods filled with metal eggs that breathed out death. Modern researchers note the description aligns with early incendiary devices used in Mongol sieges, devices known to spread disease. Torroella's work was later censored, surviving only in a single manuscript smuggled into a Jewish apothecary's codex. Coincidence or proof that marginalized communities preserved truths the powerful tried to erase? Even nursery rhymes hide clues. The English chant "Ring Around the Rosy," often linked to the plague, takes on a grimmer tone when you unpack its original lyrics. Ashes, ashes refers not to sneezing, but to burning corpses, while "We All Fall Down" mirrors reports of entire circles of dancers collapsing simultaneously, a phenomenon documented in Strasbourg during outbreaks. The rhyme's earliest version includes an extra verse, a pocket full of posies / a mask filled with rue. Rue was a medieval antiseptic, and posies were nosegays carried by doctors to mask the smell of death. This wasn't childish whimsy, it was a survival guide encoded as song. The most damning evidence, though, lies in what didn't survive. Church-led purges of heretical texts targeted not just religious dissent, but plague narratives that strayed from the official line. A 15th-century Catalan manuscript, the Book of the Black Herbs, was burned for containing recipes of pestilence. Yet fragments salvaged from its ashes describe quarantine methods and antidotes suspiciously similar to modern epidemiology. Meanwhile, sanctioned chronicles reduced the pandemic to divine punishment, scrubbing any mention of human culpability. These stories are more than echoes of trauma. They're fractures in the facade, places where the truth leaked through, because when you silence history, it doesn't vanish. It goes underground, resurfacing in the tales we tell our children, the songs we sing without thinking, the art we mistake for allegory. The Black Death's greatest secret might not be how it started, but how diligently we've been taught to dismiss the clues hidden in plain sight. Failed cures tell us as much as the ones that worked, sometimes more. When the Black Death raged, desperate healers turned to everything from crushed emeralds to toad venom. but history remembers their efforts as medieval superstition. Yet buried in the archives are glimmers of something startling, treatments that actually did slow the plague spread only to be banned, burned, or brushed aside. Why? Because healing, it turns out, was as political as it was medical. Take vinegar, a humble remedy with surprising power. Arabic physicians had documented its antiseptic properties for centuries, using it to sterilize wounds and purify water. When the plague reached Spain, communities with access to these texts washed streets with vinegar and soaked cloth masks in it, suffering far fewer deaths. But in France, church decrees condemned the practice as Saracen sorcery, ordering barrels of vinegar seized and dumped. A physician's letter from Avignon begs his bishop to reconsider, noting that towns using vinegar had but half the graves of their neighbors. The reply, a warning to cease unchristian methods or face excommunication. Then there was garlic. Hungarian peasants who ate it raw or rubbed it on buboes had survival rates triple those relying solely on prayer. But when midwives in Vienna tried to distribute garlic poultices, they were arrested for devilish charms. Court records reveal the real offense. Their remedy undermined the sale of holy amulets, blessed by local priests, amulets that cost a month's wages and did nothing. One trial transcript chillingly states, "The people must not think earthly things can avert divine punishment." Translation: desperation was profitable and knowledge threatened the racket. But the most damning evidence lies in mercury. Arab alchemists had long used it to treat infections, and Venetian merchants smuggled vials of mercury chloride into Europe as the plague spread. Where it was administered mostly to nobles and wealthy merchants, death rates plummeted. Yet public health decrees labeled it a deadly poison, punishing anyone caught using it. The hypocrisy: the same bishops decrying mercury as dangerous were quietly stockpiling it for their own households. A ledger from the papal treasury lists mercurial compounds among Clement VI's personal medical supplies, while his edicts forbade apothecaries from selling it to the vulgar masses. The suppression wasn't just about religion or greed, it was about control. In Siena, a Franciscan monk named Brother Bernardino recorded a telling incident. After discovering that boiling water and isolating the sick reduced infections in his monastery, he shared the method with neighboring villages. Within weeks, church officials arrived, burned his notes, and confined him to a cell for spreading false hope. His journal, smuggled out by a sympathetic guard, explains their fury. If the people learn to save themselves, who will they turn to for salvation? This pattern repeats in the fate of plague hospitals. In Milan, a pioneering doctor named Guglielmo da Salisto set up wards with separate rooms for the infected, fresh straw bedding changed daily, and strict hand-washing protocols. His hospital's survival rate was 4 times higher than others. But rather than replicating his model, authorities shut it down, declaring communal suffering in crowded prayer halls more pious. Da Salisto's manuals were later found in a noble family's private library, annotated with notes on how to adapt his methods for our household alone. The darkest irony: some of the most effective treatments weren't even secret. Jewish physicians in Frankfurt saved hundreds by combining quarantine with a paste of honey and crushed herbs, a recipe lifted directly from the Talmud. But when city officials demanded the formula, the doctors refused unless it was shared freely with all. The response: a pogrom that scattered the community, followed by pamphlets blaming their witchcraft for the plague's persistence. What survives in the margins of history isn't just a record of failed cures, it's a map of deliberate silencing. Because when you can dictate who lives and who dies, you don't just control bodies. You control the future, and in the ashes of the Black Death, that control was worth more than gold. The deeper we dig into the Black Death, the more the official story crumbles. We're left staring at gaps too wide to ignore. Mass graves with chemical traces that don't belong, medical texts that vanished when they were needed most, entire villages wiped out while their neighbors thrived. The evidence whispers of something far darker than rats and fleas. It hints at human hands guiding the storm, at knowledge deliberately hidden, at power structures that grew fat on the ashes of the dying. Take the genetic anomalies. Modern DNA analysis confirms some plague strains in Europe carried mutations not found naturally elsewhere, as if someone had tinkered with the bacterium's design. Then there are the skeleton's victims whose bones tell two stories, one of plague, another of toxins like arsenic and mercury that accelerated their agony. And don't forget the timing, how the deadliest waves coincided with political upheavals, land grabs, and the sudden enrichment of those who should have suffered most. Coincidences don't stack this high. The most unsettling question isn't whether the Black Death was manipulated, it's why. Who stood to gain from a continent in chaos? Was it rogue alchemists testing the limits of their art, Knights Templar settling old scores, kings and bishops tightening their grip on a shattered world? The answers are buried, but the clues remain in the scorched edges of censored manuscripts, in the frantic scribbles of monks who dared to record the truth, in the folk tales that refused to forget what history tried to erase. So here's where we're left, with a pandemic that defies natural explanation, a death toll that reshaped civilization, and a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight into the shadows. The Black Death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a turning point, a reset button pressed by someone's hand. And if we've learned anything from history, it's that the stories we're told are rarely the whole truth. They're just the version that survived. The next time you hear about a plague, a war, a catastrophe written off as inevitable, ask who wrote the ending. Because sometimes the darkest secrets aren't in the lives lost, but in the ones who got away with it. History isn't just something we read, it's something we question, debate, and piece together, one clue at a time. And now, we want to hear your voice in this conversation. Did any of these revelations about the Black Death send chills down your spine? Have you stumbled on a strange detail in an old text or local legend that hints at a hidden truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We're obsessed with the mysteries that lurk in history's shadows, and your insights might just spark the next deep dive. If you're hooked on unraveling the past's darkest enigmas, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Our channel is a vault of untold stories, from lost civilizations to covert operations buried by time, and we've got plenty more jaw-dropping investigations lined up. Want to steer our next adventure? Tell us which historical puzzle keeps you up at night: the Templars' missing treasure, the Dyatlov Pass incident, or something even stranger. This isn't just our channel, it's yours too. Together, let's peel back the layers of history and expose the secrets they never wanted us to find. And hey, if you know someone who lives for these kinds of twists, share this video with them. The best discoveries happen when curious minds collide, so keep questioning, keep digging, and remember, the past is never as simple as it seems. See you in the comments.